Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning, whether you're here in person at the Atlantic Council or watching virtually, really anywhere in the world. My name is Richard Morningstar. I'm the founding chairman of the Global Energy Center here at the Atlantic Council. Today we gather to discuss an issue of critical importance, the global journey towards net zero emissions. And recent years have seen dramatic acceleration and investment in this transition through the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, the EU Green Deal, the global response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and international commitments at COP28 to decarbonize energy systems, as well as huge investments by the private sector. However, policymakers and industry leaders tasked with realizing a sustainable energy system, and equally important, a secure energy system, find themselves navigating increasing energy security issues, geopolitical shifts and conflicts, complex supply chains, and economic volatility that creates a degree of risks associated with charting an unpaved path through the energy transition. And companies, and we're so glad to have Equinor here today, companies are under increased scrutiny as we work towards net zero. And then elections this year, such as the European parliamentary elections that took place, the EU elections that took place this past week. And as Eirik said earlier, fortunately, Norway isn't involved in that. And then again, the elections in the United States could have a tremendous impact on both energy security and on the green transition. But fortunately, the energy community is supported by experts who acknowledge these challenges, such as Eirik, and recognize the importance of overcoming them. Efforts such as Equinor's annual Energy Perspectives publication offers economic, geopolitical, and market analysis that provides strategic foresight and guides well-informed decisions and strong, resilient energy policy. To that end, we're honored to welcome our distinguished speaker, Eirik Wærness, to the Atlantic Council. Eirik is the Senior Vice President and Chief Economist at Equinor, where he has been instrumental in shaping the strategic direction of one of the world's leading energy companies. With a wealth of experience in energy markets, policy, and economics, Eirik brings a profound understanding of the complexities and opportunities that lie ahead, which he'll share with us in the annual Energy Perspectives publication. I look forward to hearing from him about this year's edition momentarily. And I'd also like to introduce our moderator today, our old friend, I might say our young old friend, and non-resident fellow at the Global Energy Center, Lee Beck, along with Lee's work here at the Atlantic Council, which has been invaluable. Ms. Beck is CATF, Clean Air Task Force's senior director in Europe, where she leads CATF's climate policy impact in Europe and focuses on advancing CATF's efforts on global climate policy. So thank you, Eirik and Lee, for being here today. And Lee, over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you so much for this wonderful introduction. Eirik, it's an honor to welcome you. I'm a huge fan of your analysis and analytical insights, so this is wonderful to share the stage with you here today. I think I couldn't give a better introduction than Ambassador Morningstar. I think really three topics that we have for this fireside chat here today is the future of climate policy in the new trade environment. This morning, Brussels announced tariffs on Chinese EVs, tariffs on US EVs coming, elections, the EU elections, upcoming US elections, half of the Democratic population globally or half of the population is going to vote in Democratic elections this year. And then, of course, also climate targets. I think headlines are mounting. We're about to miss our 2030 climate targets. So what's the scale and pace we need to advance? And before we dive in, just a few housekeeping remarks. Welcome to our audience in the room. Welcome to our audience online. This is a conversation that is public and on the record. We're streaming live right now on YouTube, X, which is formerly Twitter, Facebook, and the Atlantic Council website. If you, from your home, would like to ask a question to Eirik, please go to our webpage, which is called askac.org, and send us your question. It will be right here, and we'll ask it to Eirik. So let's go over to you. Energy Perspectives, your latest analysis came out last week. Walls and bridges are the scenarios. Talk to us a little bit about the different scenarios, and then also there's a lot of scenarios nowadays. IEA, OPEC, IEF, most energy companies have some. Tell us, how should policymakers be using and thinking about them, and are they forecasts and predictions?
Yeah, well, thanks. First, thanks for the occasion to be here. It's good to be here again. And thanks for being able to talk about what we spend a lot of our time on, in particular in May and June, when we launch Energy Perspectives. We're looking at Energy Perspectives and all the scenarios. You're looking out to 2050, generally looking at where the world's economic development or the world's energy systems are going. Of course, that's enormously uncertain business. It's driven by underlying trends, population growth, economic growth, technology changes, people's ingenuity, and then on top of that, then our ability to put in place policies that can drive the development one way or the other. And in order to describe that, what we generally then do is we build histories about the future. That's what a scenario is. And that history then describes how we think policies, development trends, technology changes put together can drive and will drive the development in one way or the other. Generally, we use what we call forecasting scenarios, which is forecasting scenarios that start today and then develop towards 2050 based on those different assumptions, the elements of the story, if you like. And in one of our scenarios, that's what we do. It's the walls, what we call the wall scenario, named after the current situation with geopolitical conflict and walls against cooperation, if you like. And then, so it's built like a forecast, but of course, given the uncertainty, you can make a lot of forecasts. It's not a very likely outcome, but we think that the actual development most likely will take place around that type of development. That's our wall scenario builds, and there's a lot of assumptions on future policy changes. So we don't only use existing policies, we also assume that for instance, the EU will continue to tighten its energy and climate policies in line with their ambitions, so that the development will move even further in that direction, even though we don't think they will reach their targets completely. And then we have the other scenario, which is more of a prescriptive, normative scenario, which we call bridges, which is a scenario where we assume that what if the world is to stay below the carbon budget consistent with the 1.5 degree scenario all the way out to 2050 and beyond. What is needed? And then that's a normative scenario where we backcast. So we say that assume that the world is actually there in 2050, and then you backcast the development. What has to happen? And what are the types of assumptions that could allow that to happen? So that's a different story. And then for policymakers to use these, I guess it's to think through what are the types of changes that we would have to put in place to make this happen. What can we do? Of course, since these are global scenarios, there's no single politician or a single entity or single region that can actually make that happen. But it's about doing our job, our elements of a job, and then in the case of the bridges scenario, the rest of the world will have to do the same. And of course, it's a massive challenge. And when you look at some of the changes that have to take place in the way we use energy, the way we produce energy, the way we change our behavior, It's in such a large global energy system as we have, which is growing. 2 billion more people will come on Earth by 2050. It's a massive challenge.
So when you're looking at your bridges scenario then, right, your normative, and you're seeing announcements such as increasing trade barriers, I think in the opening of the report you talk about the decay of multilateral institutions. So then are you just, thinking, oh, we're moving away from what really needs to happen? How do these real-time announcements factor in to really our ability to reach climate goals?
Well, I think some of them are indications that the descriptions that we've made as our basis scenario, basis underlying assumptions of our world scenario, some of the things that are happening now are confirming that that's where we are. So we are in a world of geopolitical conflict. We are in a world of lack of trust. We are in a world of limits on technology sharing, technology distribution. We have barriers to trade. We're in a world of reglobalization. We're in a world of trade wars, where also climate and energy and climate policies will be used and also understood in that context. So a limit on the or a reduction in the possibility of exports of electric vehicles or components of electric vehicles into the large markets in Europe or the United States for the Chinese would fit very well into that picture. If that picture then prevails and lasts for a long time, then it makes the necessary cooperation to undertake all the massive changes that are needed for reaching climate targets much more difficult. So we are moving away, or we're increasing the distance with the actual development relative to what is needed in that type of normative scenario. One of the reasons is that it's there's such an urgency around this. We have so little time left before we actually pass the 1.5 degree threshold for carbon concentration in the air. So in a couple of years we will look at this and then it will probably be impossible. That doesn't mean that there's not a lot of good things happening. There's a lot of good things happening that are going in the right direction. Massive energy changes, massive technology changes also in the world scenario, in spite of these inhibitors to the development, right? But it is just that looking at this 1.5 degree target as the single one thing we should do. So we have to make sure that we avoid that the best becomes the enemy of the good. There's a lot of good things happening around the world as well. We're more optimistic in terms of global warming in our world scenario now than we were several years ago, because a lot of good things are happening, partly also because the economic growth is slightly lower, right? That allows for lower energy demand growth and so on. But it is, if you're staring yourself blind at the necessary carbon budget, you can become very pessimistic.
More optimistic, that's actually surprising to hear. So I want to dig deeper. What are some really surprising findings that you would say stood out for your team that you didn't expect?
Well, since we're such good forecasters, we were not very surprised, right? but of course, some things are happening faster than what we expected. The EV penetration, in particular the growth in EVs in China, is one example that will lead to lower oil demand growth. Recent news indicate that might actually flatten out now and be less of a positive development than what we have seen over the last couple of years. And if that happens, then oil demand will grow faster or decline slower than it otherwise would have. Some of the penetration, the growth in solar electricity capacity, which is now back up at very high levels, sort of past the cost challenge that it looked like it had after COVID, is another positive development. But so much more has to happen. We're talking about 45, 50 different technologies that have to grow and be scaled and deployed very fast, both on the supply side and the demand side of the energy system. And there's only a few of them that grow sufficiently fast to be consistent with a 1.5 degree type of development. So that another surprise that for us was that we've redone the work that we did on petrochemical demand for oil and gas, and there actually we think that oil demand for petchem raw material in the petrochemical industry will be higher than what we thought. So that's positive news for oil demand. And if we can decarbonize the production of the petrochemicals in the manufacturing sector, then also the carbon issue is not that much of a problem because the carbon is contained in the products.
Right. So now I kind of want to ask about, you said oil demand, right? You saw probably the news this morning from the IEA out to 2030. Peak oil is this huge new headline. What does Energy Perspective say about it?
Yeah, we've had peak oil demand for the last 4 or 5 editions at least. We've had peak oil demand around a little bit before 2030, and I guess that's also to some extent in line with the stated policy scenario of IEA. I guess the news this morning was that IEA is upping its forecast for supply capacity. Today there's roughly 5 million barrels per day of spare production capacity around the world. If OPEC didn't limit its production, OPEC Plus didn't limit, and if we were able to utilize all the capacity that we have. And then the issue is, of course, what are the necessary, or how high are the investments in keeping that capacity either stable or growing? We have to invest every year to keep capacity from falling. And the estimates now was that there's a potential for slightly higher surplus between supply capacity and actual demand in 2030 than what IEA had expected before. I haven't looked at the analysis yet. I have my people looking at it now. I just want to say that those types of forecasts, you have to take them with a pinch of salt. First of all, there's always a surplus capacity. Over the last 10, 15 years with the shale oil revolution, what we have also seen is that some of the capacity is price dependent and more price dependent. So actually to produce up to the capacity depends on price level. If the price were to crash because of spare, or decline because of spare capacity surplus, then part of that capacity also won't come to the market. In the same way, demand is price sensitive. So with a low price for a period, demand grows faster than it otherwise would have. I saw an estimate this morning as well that the slowdown in EV penetration that we now see could amount to 1.1 million barrels per day of extra oil demand in 2030 compared to what that forecaster had looked at. So you get these combination of forces. Yeah, I think it's too early to conclude that there will be too much oil in the market by 2030.
Too early to conclude, and I think. I want to ask you, you mentioned the interesting section in the report about the decarbonization of petrochemicals, right, and the future of petrochemicals. Talk to us a little bit about, fuels as our main energy vector. It's reliable, it's existing infrastructure versus electricity, which we're shifting to. How are the scenarios looking in the trade-offs between the two?
Well, the story there is different for whether you talk about oil or gas. So on the oil side, the future of oil demand is all about transport, mainly. Because road transport today is more than half of global oil demand, roughly 50 million barrels per day, shared between light-duty vehicles, half of it, and heavy-duty vehicles, trucking on the other side. And then there's oil demand in maritime transport and air transport in addition. So the future of oil is determined by transport to a very large extent. Roughly 15-20% of oil is today used as raw material in the petchem industry. That's a growing component. So that is all about succeeding with achieving climate targets. Is basically all about making transport more efficient and much more electric, and at the margin also providing making it possible to use hydrogen in parts of transport as well, either in the form of ammonia or methanol. On the gas, and so that's that part. The petchem demand will possibly, in our 1.5 degree scenario, the oil demand that goes into petrochemical industries is 80% of the remaining oil demand. It goes to 20 million barrels by 2050. And then we have a total oil demand of 25. The remaining 5 is just air transport, basically, and a little bit of other. On the gas side, the future of gas is to a large extent determined by electrification. So you electrify more of the heating processes, either in homes or buildings or in manufacturing, and then you decarbonize electricity. Today, 20% of power generation today is gas. 40% of power generation today is coal. So if you want to replace coal with gas, you first have a growing component for gas demand, and then until you then have sufficient amounts of renewable electricity generating all that power, and we might need to grow to generate much more than twice. We have to maybe triple the power generation by 2050. And if we can then do that with renewables, then gas demand will ultimately fall also in the power sector. Otherwise, gas demand, in a 1.5 degree scenario, gas demand from manufacturing and from the heating sector in buildings and so on will also decline. And there's a growing component for gas used in the petchem industry as well. And petrochemicals is about all the stuff that we buy, every day. You have 6 liters of oil in your iPhone 14. And your makeup, or my toothbrush, my toothpaste, it's all oil. These carpets are made out of oil.
6 liters of oil in my iPhone.
14, I think, yeah,
I
somebody
didn't
told me
know that. That's huge.
Yeah, it's,
Okay.
it's, especially if you replace it every year, right?
Yeah.
With an iPhone
exactly.
16.
Right, and that's baked into your
A car
phone
is
plan.
made by oil.
Wow, I am so just blown away by how quickly you just were able to go into the trade-offs of the energy system and decarbonization. Thank you. I hope everyone enjoyed it. We're getting close to the Q&A session, so I'm encouraging everyone online, askac.org. Some questions are rolling in, as well as in the audience, to ask some questions here to Eirik. So, we've covered more and more what's happening in realities, moving into walls, yet there's still kind of optimism about some of the bridges scenarios. Aspects, 2030 climate goals. What's the most important thing policymakers or companies can do to keep us on that trajectory, or do you think we're not going to reach them?
Globally, we will not reach the ambitions, as I would say. I guess globally, we don't have climate targets for 2030. We have ambitions that will lead to the 2050. Many countries will not reach their targets, but they will move in the right direction. Hopefully, the Chinese CO2 emissions will peak before 2030. That's one example of something what you could hope for. I represent a country that will struggle seriously in reaching its own targets because the targets are really tough. But we're moving in the right direction. In order to, and it's also, I think also, providing energy is an important task, and we have to do that as efficiently as possible. Large parts of the world are characterized by energy poverty, lack of energy, expensive energy, so the affordability dimension of this is as well. So it is about providing framework conditions that could allow us both to continue to provide sufficient amounts of energy at affordable prices, and then do whatever we can to reduce the energy inefficiencies and reduce the carbon content of that energy. Be aware of the massive need for investments here. Facilitate speedy investments where possible. Facilitate scaling of these things. We might have a lot of fancy technological solutions, but the problem is to deploy them and scale them at speed. It's about, well, if we're serious about this, we have to start talking about new supply chains. Where's the new mining going to be of new rare earth minerals? How do you facilitate processing facilities and refining for providing the necessary infrastructure for the new energy systems and the old energy systems as well? And the EV revolution, as we think about it, might require 10 times more of the components of the batteries delivered to the world by 2035. Where's that going to happen? Well, how do you fight against not in my backyard, or as we say, banana type of policies, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone? And because we need the stuff, we need the factories, we need the processing facilities.
So as you're thinking about these big questions, how do you think the EU election outcome, or what might be happening, be the outcome here in the United States, can influence or would influence some of these needs?
Yeah, I think the outcome of the EU election, where at least where the political landscape has moved towards, there's not a majority, but it had moved toward increased influence of populist and protectionist type of political sentiments, make it slightly more difficult to continue with a one-dimensional decarbonization agenda upon the new commission. The commission will politically be the same as it was, but it will have a slightly less solid majority. One of the outcomes, of course, was also that President Macron in France called for a new election in France. That gamble might lead to a different political majority in Paris or in France as well, which then will determine the domestic policies of one of the largest countries in the EU. So that could change it a bit as well. So I think it's a signal also that the very clear understanding that security of supply and affordability will need to be balanced against decarbonization, and that became very clear in Europe after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that stays. And that means more balanced policies, to some extent less efficiency, more protectionist policies, which will slow down the global ability to reach these targets as well. And on the US side as well, it's a policy change here will lead to then probably slightly less optimism about the long-term impact of the Inflation Reduction Act if it were to change. We haven't seen a lot of impact yet, right, in terms of energy mix or energy demand or a lot of new stuff, because it takes time. So some of the paradox might be that the results of the Inflation Reduction Act will start to become visible during the next presidential period. But if there's a policy change, then that might lead to another expectations for a slower development in the next presidential period again. So an increased uncertainty, increased risks, less certainty about our ability to cooperate within NATO, for instance, also leads then again to Europe having to spend maybe more on defense spending and less money available for subsidizing the energy transition. So this is a complex set of variables that work together, both short and long term.
Yeah, and I actually really agree with you. I think climate action really, or climate ambition really peaked during the peak of multilateralism. And actually, we have an audience question here from Fred, who is really talking about, the kind of political challenges around decarbonization. And what he's asking, in essence, is, so Eirik, is it ever possible for the nations to be unanimous about the realities of the future of energy? Or how are we going to, as I interpret the question, how are we going to think from a global perspective about the energy trilemma going forward?
Well, that's a really good question. I think the discussion about the energy trilemma depends very much on where you are and where you sit. Large parts of the world are energy poor, don't have the technology available, massive need for growth, not necessarily in energy demand, but in energy services. And then being told that we have to household and reduce our energy demand because we have to reduce carbon emissions is a very bad proposition, or it's something that's not very popular in those parts of the world. So that is what I think. Where there is hope in the COP negotiations and in the discussion is, of course, that putting in place measures that were to drive the world in the right direction, putting a price on carbon, making sure that we signal what we don't want, which is increased emissions. There's hope there that we can develop that. Necessary subsidies for making it possible for some countries or areas to skip and move to a modern use of energy faster than they otherwise would have. But then that depends on the richest among us to be willing to both partly pay for it, partly share technology cheaply, pay properly for technology that is developed in the emerging economy so that they get an increased ability to develop themselves as well. And the likelihood of that in the current geopolitical situation is very low, unfortunately.
Right, and as we're already, this is going to be a big question at COP29, climate finance, and as we're already hearing from the bond negotiations, it seems like countries are having a hard time agreeing on dollar amounts. So with this, I think we have to, unfortunately, already close our conversation. It's been such an honor. Thank you so much online, to the guests online, for joining us, for your questions. I think, what stood out to me is that in a geopolitically fragmented world, it is increasingly this one-dimensional decarbonization agenda probably won't work, and it will come down to, really, as you said, the energy trilemma depends on where you sit and where you are in the world, and that will dictate the pace of change in the political will.
Yes.
So thank you very much for this wonderful conversation, insightful. To the audience, you can watch a recap online on the Atlantic Council website. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks for listening.